I had been boasting to my friends about my ex's size, completely unaware that he was within earshot, listening to every word. It's widely understood that an excess of anything can be harmful, yet the reality is that commonly known wisdom is often ignored. I, unfortunately, was no exception. It's a well-accepted fact that partners should avoid comparing their significant others to anyone else. Relationships, particularly marriages, are meant to be exclusive, and stepping outside their boundaries is frowned upon. Yet, despite these universal truths, people constantly disregard them. I was among those who either chose ignorance or simply refused to care. What set me apart, however, was not just my defiance, but my utter confidence that I would never be caught. I never even considered the possibility. But to help you understand how my arrogance and pride led to the downfall of my seemingly perfect marriage, let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Vanessa, and my husband, Maxwell, was the love of my life. I believed he was the only one for me. We had been married for just over a year when our world came crashing down. I wish I could say that our marriage had been perfect, but that would be far from the truth. The first year was absolute chaos. We fought incessantly, to the point where it became the norm. It didn't take long for people to start questioning if we had made a mistake in marrying each other. I had heard that the first year of marriage was often the hardest, but nothing could prepare me for the emotional turmoil I faced. At times, I felt like I was losing my sanity and even regretted saying, "I do." Despite my doubts, my friends and family assured me that this phase would pass, that every couple struggles with adjustments in the beginning. But I hadn't signed up for endless conflict. I had envisioned a life filled with love and ease. What I got instead was stress and frustration. I desperately needed a break from it all. And as if the universe had been listening, something unexpected happened. It was one of those bizarre moments where the past reaches into the present. My ex contacted me. That day had been just like any other, at least what had become normal for me. Maxwell and I had just finished another heated argument. He stormed out of the house, and I stormed into our bedroom, locking the door behind me. As I sat there, seething, my phone buzzed. It was a message from someone I never thought I'd hear from again. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have responded. I had made a conscious decision to leave my past behind. But the timing was almost too perfect, as if fate had orchestrated it. My emotions were already running high, so I replied, asking what he wanted. I was in the mood for small talk, but he explained that he had found some of my belongings while packing for his move to a new house. He reached out so I could collect them. Without hesitation, I told him to throw everything away. I didn't care what he did with any of it. He asked if I was sure, and I confirmed that nothing here could possibly be of value to me anymore. After that, I tossed my phone aside, indifferent to whether my response had been rude. The following day, my ex called, once again asking if I was certain about discarding my things. My frustration only grew. I lashed out, accusing him of using this as an excuse to talk to me. I called it a sad and desperate attempt and demanded that he leave me alone, before abruptly ending the call. Just then, my husband walked into the room and asked who I had been speaking with. Normally, I would have brushed it off, but something in his eyes told me that this conversation was far from over. I didn't want to tell him the truth, not because I had anything to hide, but simply to avoid another argument. However, I figured honesty was best, so I admitted that I had been speaking with my ex. The tension in my husband's body was immediate, anger flashing across his face as he warned me to stay away from my former partner. I chuckled, deliberately taunting him, insisting that he didn't control me and that I could do whatever I pleased. I wanted to get under his skin, and I could tell it was working. His voice grew firmer as he reminded me that I was married, frustration evident in his words. He wasn't cruel, but his emotions were clear. He was upset that I had any contact with my ex at all. Strangely, that moment seemed to shift something in our marriage. After that, our arguments became less frequent. I couldn't pinpoint exactly how or why, but somehow we started understanding each other better. We were both calmer and more patient. It felt odd, almost unnatural, but perhaps there was truth to the saying that the first year of marriage is the hardest. I was relieved when the tension in our home eased. My husband was more attentive, always ready to listen. It felt as though we had finally adapted to each other's flaws and quirks, rekindling the intoxicating connection we once had while dating. For a while, everything seemed perfect, until it wasn't. One morning, an urgent knocking on my door startled me. The loud, relentless pounding made me rush to answer, momentarily convinced I was being pursued for a debt I didn't owe. When I opened the door, I found my sister standing there, looking furious. Her first words to me were an accusation. I was unbelievable. Confused, I asked her what she meant. She wasted no time explaining that my ex had shown up at her place with a box of my things. He had told her that I had asked him to throw them away, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to do it. My sister was livid. I dismissed her outrage, telling her she was overreacting. It was my stuff. After all, so why did she care? More importantly, why had my ex gone to her instead of just doing as I had asked? That's when she revealed the devastating truth. The belongings I had so carelessly asked him to discard weren't just old clothes or forgotten keepsakes. They were gifts from my late mother, irreplaceable items she had passed down to me before she died. I was stunned. The weight of what I had almost done crashed over me. I had been so blinded by frustration that I nearly erased precious pieces of my mother's memory. It was a cruel realization, a painful lesson in how anger can cloud judgment. After enduring my sister's furious lecture for most of the morning, I reached out to my ex. I wanted to talk. At first, he refused, reminding me that I had made it clear he should leave me alone. But when I sincerely thanked him for saving those belongings, he softened. We talked, and by the end of our conversation, he agreed to meet me. The idea of seeing him again after so long made me anxious. Since our breakup, I had intentionally kept my distance, even moving to another city to start fresh. But now, here I was, willingly stepping back into familiar territory. We met at a coffee shop, and the moment I saw him, my breath caught. He looked different, taller, stronger, with a beard that made him seem even more imposing. He had changed in ways I hadn't expected, like a towering tree that had grown more formidable over time. It made me wonder, had I changed as well? Was I still the same person he once knew? We spent the morning catching up over coffee, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and uncertainty. It was evident that my ex had transformed into someone entirely different. He was no longer the man I had once dated and parted ways with, the one who had been selfish and held on to grudges. This version of him was far more composed, not even remotely upset about how I had spoken to him before. My apology was enough for him, which made me question whether I had taken any time to grow the way he clearly had, both physically and emotionally. After our unexpected reunion, we started talking more frequently. I made sure my husband remained unaware of this because he had never approved of my ex. He always believed my ex was a toxic influence and never trusted our dynamic. To keep the peace of my marriage, I had initially cut off all ties with my ex, but deep down, I also did it for myself. I never imagined that I would need to speak to him again after getting married, but fate had other plans. A few weeks after our unexpected meeting, I visited my sister. She had calmed down significantly since her outburst that morning at my house. She told me she had forgiven my oversight, but that didn't mean I was getting off easy. As a form of subtle punishment, she roped me into helping her in the kitchen. I was more than happy to oblige, especially if it meant she would finally let go of her frustration. While we prepared food, she casually asked if I had seen my ex. I hesitated, but I knew my sister well enough to understand that she would find out the truth eventually. So I admitted that I had met him to apologize. She then asked if I had been as surprised as she was by how much he had changed. I was relieved that she had noticed it too. I didn't want to feel like I was imagining things. She confessed that when she first saw him, she didn't even recognize him. He had to introduce himself, and even then, she struggled to believe it was really him. We laughed about it, and soon after, as I was leaving her house, my phone rang. Seeing my ex's name on the screen startled me. He asked if I was busy, and after a brief moment of consideration, I told him I wasn't. Then, he invited me to meet him somewhere. When I pressed for details, he remained mysterious, only giving me an address. I hesitated, weighing my options. It felt like stepping into something I shouldn't, like a fish eyeing bait, knowing it was dangerous but unable to resist curiosity. Eventually, I agreed and went to the location he had provided. To my surprise, it was a theater, an actual live performance venue. He had arranged for us to watch a stage play, and I had no objections. I had nothing else planned for the day, and I had never attended a stage play before. So excitement bubbled within me. He had already secured tickets, and our seats were some of the best in the house, offering a perfect view of every moment unfolding on stage. The theme of the play revolved around rediscovering the worth of things and embracing second chances. I couldn't help but wonder, had my ex deliberately chosen this play? Did he know what it was about beforehand and invite me with a hidden message in mind? Regardless, it stirred something within me. I had already acknowledged that he had changed, but seeing him in this setting, looking even more attractive than before, made me start questioning things I had never considered. Throughout the performance, I found myself glancing at him repeatedly. I mirrored his emotions, smiling when he smiled, laughing when he laughed. It was as though I was watching the entire play through his expressions rather than the actors on stage. Something unexpected happened that night. It wasn't just nostalgia resurfacing. It was something new, something unfamiliar, genuine attraction. I admired his transformation, the way he had rebuilt himself into a better version, and I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't been before. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. But despite knowing this, I couldn't seem to stop myself. As the play ended and we stepped out of the theater, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my husband. He sent me a message saying he wouldn't be coming home that night, buried under a mountain of work. It felt like fate was orchestrating events beyond my control. My ex gently pulled me aside, locking eyes with me, and asked if I was truly happy. At first, I thought he was referring to the play, so I told him it had been wonderful and I had enjoyed it thoroughly. He chuckled, shaking his head. I'm not talking about the play. I mean your life. Are you happy? His question caught me off guard. Where had that come from? It seemed so random, so out of the blue. I hesitated, trying to decipher his intent. I don't understand what you mean, I admitted. He took a step closer, holding my gaze with quiet intensity. Are you happy? He repeated. My immediate reaction was to say yes, to reassure him and myself. But when I opened my mouth, the words refused to come. I just stood there, frozen, staring at him as if I had lost the ability to speak. A persistent thought itched at the back of my mind, a thought that I knew would change everything. I could sense what was about to happen, and I had every opportunity to prevent it. A simple step back would have created the necessary distance, but I remained rooted to the spot, a statue carved from hesitation and suppressed longing. Before I could process it, he closed the space between us and pressed his lips against mine. My eyes widened at the unexpected contact, but gradually they fluttered shut, surrendering to the moment. The kiss was deep, slow, intoxicating, far more electrifying than anything I had felt in years. It consumed me, unraveling every inhibition. Our hands moved instinctively, exploring, seeking. It was without a doubt the most intense kiss I had ever experienced, surpassing even the one I shared with my husband on our wedding day. It was a cruel thought, but it was the truth. My husband had never kissed me like this. My ex was a master at igniting emotions, and now, with our connection forbidden, our desire intensified tenfold. It was everything, raw, overwhelming, endless. I felt weightless, as though I could float away. But when I opened my eyes, I was still firmly on the ground. The kiss ended with a quiet finality. But I knew this was just the beginning. He offered to drive me home, and without hesitation, I agreed. I knew my husband wouldn't be there, so I had no fear of being caught. When he extended his arm, I took it eagerly, my fingers gripping him so tightly that I half expected to pierce through his suit and into his skin. He led me to his car, opened the door, and ensured I was settled before circling around to the driver's side. Before starting the engine, he turned to me again, his gaze unwavering. "You're beautiful," he murmured. His unexpected compliment sent a jolt through me. The entire night had been a series of surprises, each one pulling me deeper under a spell. As he drove, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. When we arrived at my home, he parked and turned toward me with a smirk. "I'd love to take you out again," he said smoothly. I chuckled, shaking my head. "If you're asking me out on a date, just say it outright." He laughed, shaking his head. "Who said anything about a date?" That was when I realized just how caught up I was. I had been so enthralled that I had mistaken our night out for something more. Heat crept up my neck, and I quickly looked away. "Good night," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape my own embarrassment, but before I could step out, he grabbed my waist. His grip was firm yet gentle, sending a shiver down my spine. He wasn't just holding me back. He was igniting something within me, something primal, something dangerous. My breath hitched as I felt the undeniable pull between us that I stared at him, confused, and asked what he was doing. His response was simple: "Don't go yet." I frowned, waiting for an explanation, but he stayed silent, his eyes locked onto mine. Impatience crept in, and I told him that if he had nothing to say, I was heading inside. But before I could finish my sentence, his lips crashed into mine, silencing me completely. The kiss was so intense, so filled with desire, that when we finally pulled apart, the only words I could muster were an invitation into my home. He hesitated, asking if I was certain, and I nodded without a second thought. At that moment, my mind had shut down, leaving only the fire in my veins to guide me. We barely made it to the front door before our hands roamed freely, shedding layers like autumn leaves. That night, we gave in to everything we had once suppressed, tangled in sheets and lost in each other. When it was over, he held me for a while before slipping away into the night. I should have felt guilt, but I didn't, not even a trace of it. The next morning, my husband was still absent, and the excitement bubbling inside me was too much to keep to myself. Luckily, my closest friend came over. She was my confidant, the one person I could tell anything without fear or judgment. The moment she walked in, she noticed the urgency in my voice and laughed, asking what was so important. We settled in the kitchen, and I spilled every detail, leaving nothing out. I told her how it felt, the words he whispered, the way he touched me. It was intoxicating. Then she threw out a question that caught me off guard. "So who's bigger, your husband or your ex?" I burst into laughter, shaking my head, and told her it wasn't even fair comparison. My ex was undeniably bigger. Even if my husband took something to help his case, it wouldn't make a difference. I even joked about how my ex knew exactly how to handle me in ways my husband never could. And that was when I heard it. A voice. My husband's voice. "Oh, really?" I froze. My heart plummeted. My body went cold. I turned to find him standing there, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with rage. He had been home long enough to hear every single word. The realization sent a shockwave through me. He wasn't just angry, he was devastated. What followed in the coming weeks was something I never could prepare for. My husband became someone I didn't recognize. The warmth, the patience, the man I once knew, gone. In his place was a stranger, cold and vicious. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words dripped with venom. He would ignore me for days, and when he finally acknowledged my existence, it was only to humiliate me. I became nothing more than a disgrace in his eyes. To make matters worse, he didn't suffer in silence. He made sure the world knew what I had done. He told our neighbors, our friends, anyone who would listen, that I was a liar and a cheater. My reputation crumbled overnight. I became the woman people whispered about behind closed doors. One night, he came home bruised and battered. I rushed to help him, but he shoved me away as if my touch was poison. He spat words that cut deeper than any wound. He said he would rather bleed out on the floor than let me lay a hand on him. That was the moment I realized he didn't just hate me, he despised me. Our home became a war zone, a place where resentment festered. He no longer slept in our bed, choosing instead to camp out on the couch or even the floor. Then, one night, after crying myself to sleep, I felt the bed shift. He had climbed in beside me. "Are you awake?" His voice was soft, eerily familiar. the way it used to be before everything fell apart. Hope swelled in my chest. I turned to him, eyes glistening, and whispered, "Yes." His expression darkened. His voice dropped as he murmured, "I just wanted to remind you, you're the devil, and there's no saving you." I broke. The dam of emotions I had been holding back shattered, and tears streamed down my face. But he didn't care. He simply chuckled, a cruel, hollow sound, before getting up and leaving. The next morning, divorce papers sat on the table. I signed them without protest. There was nothing left to fight for. A month later, it was finalized. We sold a house and divided what we had, then walked away from each other as if we had never existed in the same world. But the worst part? My ex never called me again. I tried reaching out, but I had been blocked on every platform, every possible way of contacting him. It was as if I had never mattered at all. Just another name on his list, a fleeting conquest he could check off and move on from. I had thrown everything away for one night, and in the end, I was left with nothing. If only I had valued what I had before it was too late.